Welcome, everyone. I'm Susan Bauer-Wu, the president of the Mind and Life Institute. I'm in Charlottesville, Virginia, where we're having a winter snowstorm, and I hope that you are safe and well wherever you are in the world. It's really wonderful to see all the names of old friends and new ones from all over the world. Thank you so much for being here with us today. Mind and Life's work sits at the intersection of contemplative wisdom, research, and action. And we recognize that the complexity of today's challenges need and value bringing together diverse perspectives, disciplines, and voices to create solutions. And creating spaces where multidisciplinary dialogue can take place that really lies at the heart of our work. And that's why I'm so happy that you can be part of the conversation today in our third Inspiring Minds program. Our theme today is Finding Connections, Pathways to Embodied Wisdom. And I'm delighted to welcome as our featured speakers, Dr. Peter Wayne and Lama Willa Blythe Baker, and our guest performer, sitarist Srinivas Reddy. It's going to be an amazing program. And today is especially unique in our Inspiring Minds program because we're going to be announcing the recipient of this year's Catherine Kerr Award for Courageous and Compassionate Wisdom. And that will include a special presentation given by the recipient. And then after that, we'll proceed with our normal Inspiring Minds program and format, which will include a musical performance and a rich conversation moderated by our host, Shankri Goldstein, and closing with a meditation. So I'm thrilled, really thrilled to announce that Dr. Peter Wayne is the recipient of Mind and Life's 2020 Catherine Kerr Award for Courageous and Compassionate Science. The award honors the memory of our dear friend, Cathy Kerr, a neuroscientist and a humanist whose brilliance and fiery spirit and out-of-the-box innovation touched all our hearts and left a remarkable legacy for the field of contemplative science. Cathy was a dedicated practitioner and scientist of embodied Eastern wisdom practices. So it's fitting and wonderful that this year's Catherine Kerr Award goes to a fellow Tai Chi and Qigong practitioner and researcher. Peter Wayne has had a distinguished career with over 25 NIH-funded research studies, studying contemplative, mind-body, and other integrative medicine approaches. Peter is the director of the Osher Center for Integrative Medicine at the Harvard Medical School and Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston. And besides numerous peer-reviewed publications, Peter is the author of an award-winning book, The Harvard Medical School Guide to Tai Chi. And we're so pleased that Peter will be joining us again for our Summer Research Institute, where he is the Tai Chi teacher for our week-long program. And this year, our Summer Research Institute theme is on human-earth connection, which is also fitting with Peter because he started his career in ecology. And beyond Peter's remarkable professional accolades, even more importantly, Peter exemplifies the qualities and character that Cathy brought to her work. Bold innovation, imagination, courage, authenticity, and heartfulness. So on behalf of the Mind and Life Institute, our deepest congratulations extend to Dr. Peter Wayne for this very well-deserved honor. And before I pass it on to Peter, I'd like to take a moment to thank Mind and Life supporters for your generosity in making our work possible. And to those of you who made a contribution as part of the registration process today, deep appreciation to all of you. So now I'd like to welcome Peter Wayne to share his special presentation about finding connections. Congratulations and much gratitude, Peter.
Susan, thank you so very much for the very kind introduction. Being fortunate enough to have known Cathy Kerr personally, I'm really deeply honored and humbled by this award. So I start with this yin-yang cartoon for two reasons. And for any of you who can't read it, I'll read the caption. It says, "How much longer with this social distancing thing?" And first, I share it because I really wish we could all be together under one roof in a much more intimate setting. But I also share this cartoon as it symbolizes the heart of what I want to share with you today, which I think reflects one of the important aspects of both Cathy and my own transdisciplinary and somewhat unorthodox journeys through academia. Namely, how exploring edges, where one discipline ends and another one begins, can lead to a kind of synergy and create a space for novel ideas and ways of thinking to emerge. So the idea of synergy and emergence is implicit in the yin-yang symbol, as we all know, and its underlying philosophy of Taoism, which purports that yin and yang in their commingling is what's called the mother of 10,000 things. But I also think that this idea of synergy at the edges can be practically seen all around us. In nature, for example, and Susan mentioned my background in ecology, where cold and warm waters come together, for example, in coastal ecosystems, there's turbulence and mixture and upwelling, and that generates a lot of productivity and generally species richness, so things coming together. Similarly, we all know when people connect and work together, much more can be accomplished when they work alone than when they work alone. And of course, when we nourish the connections within ourselves, and within ourselves and between ourselves and the physical and social environments, that's where we believe health and wellness emerge. And I think Cathy epitomizes a seeker who courageously explored connections at the edges. I first met Cathy in the year 2000 when we both joined an interdisciplinary think tank at the Harvard Medical School led by Ted Kepchuk. It was a beautifully strange group. Cathy arrived as a social scientist who was attracted to placebo research. I was an evolutionary biologist interested in traditional East Asian medicine. Ted Kepchuk modeled and normalized what we call anti-disciplinary thinking. Early on, Cathy and I had the opportunity to collaborate on both placebo and acupuncture research, after which Cathy shifted her focus to the neurobiology of mind-body practices. Ted reminded me of her bold transition. One day, Cathy came in with this big fat textbook on neuroscience, and she proclaimed, "I'm teaching myself to become a neuroscientist." She had never had courses in that area before. And we all know how remarkably well that turned out. Since then, I've always thought of her as one of the smartest and most courageous scientists I've known, with a keen gift of exploring rich edges. I think this quote captures her spirit beautifully, and in case you can't read because of a small screen, I'll read it for you. "A wise person does not fear the edges and fringes, but studies them. Indeed, he or she is often in them, working to make change happen." I think that captures Cathy's spirit beautifully. So in the remaining few minutes, I want to shift to a few of my own explorations at the edges, including my own career shift, some explorations around what we call the connection between mind and body, and the dance between being a researcher as well as a practitioner and teacher of mind, body, and contemplative practices. So like Cathy, I made a significant career change around 2000. After about 15 years of being a PhD student and postdoc and junior faculty at Harvard, studying evolutionary ecology and then climate change, I jumped ship quite drastically and started a research program at a college of traditional Chinese medicine. My goal in this transition was to refocus and sort of combine my research interests with my deepening commitment to understanding, practicing, and teaching Tai Chi and related East Asian practices. And the richness and opportunities of this boundary crossing became apparent quite quickly for me. So shortly after we published a couple papers showing that Tai Chi can be beneficial to patients with heart failure or balance disorders, some of my more skeptical colleagues began to ask, how do we know this stuff isn't just all placebo? What's the active ingredient? And of course, as an ecologist, my first thought was, do we only get to pick one active ingredient? So this led my group and others to characterize Tai Chi and related practices as multimodal interventions, ecological interventions, with lots of active ingredients. And just briefly, there's a lot going on in this cartoon, a diagram, where we can see there's all these components: mechanical pieces, cognitive pieces, affective pieces, social pieces, breathing. And the idea is that these unique interventions are very different than a drug that targets a specific receptor in the body and enacts its change through there. Here we've got lots of different active ingredients that hit lots of physiological systems and tries to enhance the crosstalk and the synergy between them. And we think that it's health that emerges out of this crosstalk. So accordingly, our group and others have begun to borrow tools from systems biology and quantitative ecology to characterize the health benefits of these multimodal interventions. And I think even more broadly, this sort of framework has led us to redefine integrative medicine, not so much as just putting an acupuncturist in a pain clinic or a mind-body practitioner in a stress clinic, but trying to see the whole person and treating and enhancing the interconnections between those interdependent systems. And again, I think health emerges out of that rich crosstalk, and disease starts to creep in when they start to break down. And therefore, healthcare providers are akin to kind of gardeners or stewards, helping to cultivate this resilience and wholeness of people. One specific example of this more ecological approach to health that I know greatly interested Kathy, as well as myself, is shifting research related to mind-body connection to a more embodied framework. And this is a topic we'll come back to a little later today in our dialogue with Willa Baker and Shankri Goldstein. Kathy and I bet many others on this webinar today, began to question what we perceived as an overemphasis of what might be called a top-down or brain rules body paradigm, even though we all believed in the mind-body connection, with less of an appreciation for the intelligence of the body as a whole. And with that, more limited appreciation for mind-body moving contemplative practices, and even measures of integrative health that are focused on the body and not just the brain. I think this top-down bias is nicely challenged by Guy Claxton in his book called Intelligence in the Flesh. And again, for those who have a small screen, I'll read this. My mind was not parachuted in to save and supervise some otherwise helpless concoction of dumb meat. No, it's just the other way around. My intelligent flesh has evolved, as part of its intelligence, strategies and capacities that I think of as my mind. I am smart precisely because I am a body. I do not own it or inhabit it, but from it I arise. And I think later in our conversations before this event, Willa's going to bring in the concept of bodyfulness as a complement and balance to the emphasis on mindfulness. My own interest in a more embodied framework for understanding health, and also my background in Tai Chi, led to exploring how cognitive and motive processes interact to impact balance and gait in older adults, and how Tai Chi influences this. And what you can see in this diagram, this is real data from an elderly woman in one of our lab studies. She's walking in the top panel here without any distractions. And here she's being asked to do the same walk while she's counting backwards by sevens. You can see two things. This is in real time. So in the bottom panel, she's walking much slower. It takes her much longer to do the loop. But you can also see the irregularity in these spacings and positions of these steps relative here to the above. So there's a cost to this cognitive distraction. And what we want to know over time is whether Tai Chi will help toggle between these cognitive motor interactions. And indeed, without showing you the data, we have a number of studies that have shown after doing Tai Chi, she walks much more like this than she does like this, even with a cognitive task. But the bigger point I want to make is that we don't need to scan the brain to study executive function or executive cognitive motor interactions, but we can see it in the body, and in the body doing very important activities of daily living. Working with my friend and colleague, Evan Thompson, and one of my predoctoral students, Camilla Asipiak, I've also become interested in exploring how body postures of Tai Chi and Qigong and yoga and pretty much anything else can influence our psychological well-being. One recent example of this work is a pilot study with breast cancer survivors that have a horrible situation that's referred to as persistent post-surgical pain. So in addition to the initial trauma of being diagnosed with cancer and then undergoing very invasive procedures, chemotherapy and radiation, and then either unilateral or bilateral mastectomy or lumpectomy, they come out the other end with chronic pain, which keeps reminding them about their cancer and the fear of recurrence. And it's just a horrible mix of symptoms. And because of that biopsychosocial problem, it's not just a physical pain, we thought a multimodal intervention like Qigong would be really helpful. And by and large, what we found was that a 12-week intervention, it's a small study, but provocative, improved pain, anxiety, depression, but it also, from this embodied framework, helped women feel more settled in their body. This is a quote from one of the women that I think captures that, and they were incredibly articulate in sharing their experiences. How you feel about your body is a challenge after you've had breast cancer. Qigong helps you think about your body in a different way and to trust your body, to get inside yourself in a different way. It doesn't mean you're not going to get cancer again, but it could mean that you're more at peace with your body. Many of these women describe being violated by these, this diagnosis, and this helped them settle back in. We also brought people into the lab to explicitly test the relationship between posture and mood. And in brief, we have very sophisticated, precise measures of body posture. Here we have the angle of the carriage of the head from a more drooped position to a more upright, confident position. And we saw nice correlations between changes over these 12 weeks in vertical head angle and degrees of depression, as well as some other outcomes. This is preliminary data. And the point I want to just finish here with is not that changing your posture changes your mood, or changing your mood changes your posture, but that it's crazy to think of these as independent, that they're integrated in this embodied framework. And if you don't believe that data, you can always go to Charles Schulz. This is one of his cartoons from the 70s, one of my favorite. Here's Charlie Brown talking to Lucy, and he says, "This is my depressed stance. When you're depressed, it makes a lot of difference how you stand. The worst thing you can do is straighten up and hold your head high, because then you start to feel better. If you're going to get any joy out of being depressed, you got to stand like this." So finally, in just the last couple moments here, I want to say that Kathy and I were both committed, and I remain committed, mind-body practitioners, like many of you on the webinar today. And I think the interplay between the firsthand personal experiences we have with our practices and the research we pursue greatly influences both our professional and personal trajectories. And there's not enough time to unpack this idea today, but I think it'd be a great topic for greater discussion at the Mind and Life in general. But in brief, the metaphor I'd like to share with you today is that in many ways, practitioner researchers have two complementary laboratories. In our personal practices and in teaching and watching our students learn, novel ideas can come up that we can bring to our academic shops to more formally explore using structured scientific methods. Conversely, the results of our studies and the wisdom and insights we get about our bodies and minds from interacting with our colleagues and reading the literature can deeply impact how we experience and teach the richness of our practices. The balance between these two sources of information, in my opinion, is really important for progress in both pursuits. So again, my sincere thanks to the Mind and Life Institute for this honor. Putting together these brief comments brought me back to many, many sweet memories of Kathy and made me realize how much, like many of you, I miss her. And thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Peter, for that incredible presentation, and congratulations on this well-deserved award. So my name is Shankri Goldstein, and I'm joining you today from seized Monacan land in Scottsville, Virginia. I invite all of you to take a moment and acknowledge those who came before you on the land upon which you sit today, and please feel free to drop that in the chat. Along with this wonderful presentation from Peter and having him as a guest, I'd love to introduce our second guest for today, which is Lama Willa Blythe Baker, who's the founder and spiritual director of the Natural Dharma Fellowship in Boston, Massachusetts, and its retreat center, Wonderwell Mountain Refuge in Springfield, New Hampshire. She was authorized as a Dharma teacher and lineage holder in the Kagyu lineage of Tibetan Buddhism after 12 years of monastic training and 2 consecutive 3-year retreats. At present, her teaching interests include embodied mindfulness, non-dual awareness, and compassion. So in a few moments, we'll be speaking directly with her and Peter and having a conversation. But first, we're going to open our episode with a contemplative arts offering from Srina Vasreti. Srini is a scholar, a translator, and a musician. He studied classical South Asian languages and literature at UC Berkeley and currently teaches at Brown University and Gadingar, please correct me if that's incorrect. Srinivas is also a concert sitarist and spends his time performing, teaching, and conducting research around the world. He has also written several books. So I'd love to welcome Srinivas. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you to, well, everyone at Mind and Life. I've had a beautiful relationship with everyone there for quite some time, and it's an honor to play again and to be with all of you. Just very quickly, I will be playing, this is a sitar. It's a North Indian instrument. And I will be playing Rag Patdeep, which is an afternoon raga. And ragas are, well, it's a complex thing, but they're kind of melodic worlds. And part of it is trying to elicit, or really the whole point of Indian art is to create an emotional state. And hopefully through that kind of emotional, artistic kind of experience, to have some kind of peace at the end of that. So I will try to do my best to do that. And everything's improvised, and I'll try to be as short as possible and stay within the time. I guess one last thing is that as my Parama Guru says, you know, Indian music is the music of nature. It's very related to the place and the time of day and one's psychic kind of mood. You know, but he'd always say, you know, when you stop talking, nature speaks. So I will stop talking now and I will play Rag Patdeep. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Srini. Truly wonderful offering. That was fantastic. We're going to be inviting Srinivas back to share insights with us at the end of this episode. So now I'd like to invite Peter and Willa to come up on screen with us. Before we move into the conversation with Peter and Willa, I encourage all of our participants to add questions to the Zoom chat box. Our team is going to capture those questions for those who wish to have me ask them directly as we move into public Q&A. There's an opportunity for you to raise your hand and ask directly too, but the more questions that we capture now, the more questions we'll get in as we move into the public Q&A section. So first, I want to just say I'm deeply honored that we're getting to learn so much about Kathy's work and impact, not only with the Mind and Life Institute, but with the world of research and contemplative science. And so my first question for you, Willa, is I'm wondering if you have any interactions, excuse me, or personal stories that you'd like to share about Kathy as well.
Thank you so much, Shankari. I did meet Kathy just once, and it was a very memorable meeting. I had asked a friend of mine, Gael, who is, I think, here, about who I might contact. And I was researching the relationship between meditation and the body, and who I might talk to, who reflect with, who is a scientist on the wisdom of the body, but from a scientific perspective. And Gail suggests that I talk to Kathy. So I got her number and called her. And at that time, I'd never met her. She said that she was feeling a little under the weather. That was how she put it, which it turned out to be quite an understatement. She was quite ill at the time. And she said, I'm horizontal and I'm having I'm a little under the weather. So we talked, and in that talk, she shared with me some of her research, indicating that, I remember in particular, she was describing that in her belief, the evidence showed that there was a reverse correlation between paying attention to, dropping attention into the body and rumination, the kind of rumination that we see present in depression or anxiety, that when you drop into the body, that rumination circuitry in the brain calms down. And she turned me to a place where I could read more about that. But what really impressed me about that conversation was that even, and later, of course, not so much at the time, but later when I understood how ill she was, the disease that took her life, was how even in the midst of her own body's dissolution, she was full of compassion and readiness to share what she knew with somebody that she had never met. So that to me just spoke to her of her character and her kindness.
The reflection that you just shared, it also makes me think of the word resilience. And it leads me to connect to Abraham Maslow's theory of human motivation. So in this theory, he describes the basic physiological needs of humans at the lowest tier of this pyramid system that he's created. And as we evolve, we move closer to self-actualization. And so as we move through the stages of this pyramid, we become more social. And we move into stages of love and belonging. And Peter spoke about this in his presentation. He spoke about humans working together to achieve goals. So clearly we crave social needs with other people. And I feel like that just that interaction between you and Kathy really showed there with that human connection. So craving social needs with other people before focusing on what we are fully capable of doing as individuals at the highest level. So this question is for you, Willa. Can you share why relationships are so critical to our evolution as human beings, and maybe how Sangha shows up for you in your practice?
Thank you. Yeah, when I first started studying meditation and studying Buddhism, I was in my 20s when I first started seriously in on that. I had been meditating for a while at that point, but I hadn't studied much. And as I first encountered a more serious study of Buddhism, I idea, as many of us do when we first learn meditation, that meditation is a solitary activity, that it is something that it's sort of forged in your own mind, and that it's all about your own efforts. And I think in my early study of Buddhism, I believed that. I remember thinking that. And then, but over time, noticing that community is so powerful in the practice of meditation to sustain itself over a long period of time. It's not easy to be on a path of meditation or awakening as a solitary quest. And even the Buddha said in this one sutra, where he was speaking to his one student, Ananda asked him, Buddha, isn't the Sangha means community, isn't the Sangha half of the holy life? And the Buddha replied, no, Ananda, the Sangha community is the whole of the holy life. So even the founder of Buddhism, who so emphasized the power of meditation, the importance of meditation for human evolution and development, acknowledged that it can't be done really without connection and community. So I think community is now I see it as critical to human flourishing, and to even going deep with a contemplative practice such as meditation.
Yeah, Peter, in your presentation, I love that you touched so much about interrelational aspects of the body, mind, breath, and movement. And what makes this episode so special is that we're talking about pushing the edge of what is already known about these ancient practices. And I find that what generally stops people from engaging in meditation practice, which you both are, so skilled at discussing and talking about, is that they fear that they won't do it the right way. People just don't know how to show up on the mat, how to sit with their thoughts, with their mind, with their body. And what I'm finding out from both of you through our different conversations is that we can speak about self-actualization and the needs by integrating the oneness of the body and mind, and even perhaps our surrounding environment. So I was really excited that you were joining us, Peter, because given the inner transformation that's needed in order to realize a shift in our collective consciousness and a realization of shared responsibilities toward each other and the planet, can you speak a little bit about the interrelational pathways to awakening from an ecological perspective?
Well, that's a really rich question, Shankri. I think some of it goes back to your question to Willa, or the comments about groups. And I will say that groups are showing up more and more in the healing community, even in group medical visits, not only from a practical perspective of having a group of people together for billing purposes, but that there's an emergence that happens. And some of my colleagues have been starting to call it the special sauce. You bring people together and 1 + 1 = way more than 2. And there's something that happens. And even in movement-based exercises, there's studies where you have someone sitting in a rocking chair and someone else starts rocking with them. And so how people move, how they hang out together creates a sense of connection. But I think going back to what I understand is at the heart of your question is, what's the link between what we do within ourselves and how it affects bigger social change? And I recently have been going back a little bit to the climate change issue, just because it's so in the forefront and it's so vast and huge. And the conclusion of this short piece that I wrote is think globally, act extremely locally, meaning contemplate your navel. And that as we learn about ourselves, as we learn to become aware of our cravings and the things we don't need to go shopping for, and to realize in our practices, like Willow was saying, that the boundary between ourselves and others starts to dissolve. We start to connect to a much larger concept of action in the world. And I think we want to be aware of those. We want to steer our energies there, but without going in at the same time and sort of managing our own ecosystems, we're not going to be that successful.
Willa, would you like to add to that? Maybe some insights on the oneness of the body and mind connection?
I was just thinking about, as Peter was talking, I was remembering a time when I was, I don't know, maybe 20 years old, and just your quintessential early 20s Asian experience. And I was, hiked up the side of a mountain to find a yogi who was up there, and people had been recommending this yogi as someone to get a teaching from. I was going up there, and went into his little hut, and he was a wizened old soul, and just beautiful human being. And I had no idea what he would say or what he would offer. But we asked him, would you please give a teaching? And he gave a teaching on something that he called the nature of mind. And then at some point I asked a question, what is this nature of mind? And his reply, to my surprise, is he said, it's not only inside, it's not only outside, it pervades. And this word, it pervades, became like this koan, or this puzzle for me for several years. Like, what does it pervade? Does it pervade the universe? Does it pervade? And over time, I wonder now if he meant it pervades the body. It pervades that this thing that we call the mind, it pervades everything, every corner of our experience, and absolutely including the body. I think we often think as Westerners, when we're first learn a term like mindfulness, that somehow mindfulness happens from the neck up. We're becoming mindful, that it's somehow this top-down experience of the control of the organism. But in fact, like Peter was saying, there's a possibility for a bottom-up model, that we can listen to the body and discover that the body is already mindful. And bodyfulness, the body is already paying attention. The body is already listening to and regulating with its environment. And so maybe then meditation and mindfulness is not so much an activity of control as it is an activity of surrendering to this body's natural groundedness and wisdom. So I wonder sometimes now, when I think back on that story, maybe that's what he meant.
Yeah, I love that quote that Peter shared from his cancer patients. I wrote it down: trust your body to become more at peace with it, the Qigong practice. And, you spoke about surrendering, and it actually leads me to think about impermanence, the body and this impermanence. So if we're to follow the doctrine of impermanence in Buddhist traditions, then everything is constantly changing, constantly evolving. Death isn't really death. It's that holding place before the next existence. But most people think about impermanence as a thing that happens later. And I see this when I try to have conversations with people, deep conversations with people about regenerative farming and, combating climate crisis, to go back to your point, Peter. But later is actually really now in terms of that topic for me. So can each of you share your thoughts, maybe beginning with Willa, on how impermanence can be a pathway for change?
Yeah, I think, when we think about impermanence, we often think of loss. That impermanence is about the dissolution of things. But just as equally, right, impermanence makes room for other things to exist. Impermanence is not so much about death, that it's a reflection on impermanence. It's more about the truth of flow. And somehow I like the word flow when we think about impermanence, because when we think about change, change also has this sense of something maybe frightening. We've had a lot of change in the last couple of years, something that is about unsteadiness. But flow, it's the same thing. But if we think about it as flow, this fact that the body is here for a while and then it will dissolve into the earth, it will dissolve into the planet where it came from, and awareness will go wander where it goes next. then it's a much different paradigm. I like that word flow. And I do wonder what Peter would say about that, like what word you would use, or what paradigm you'd use to talk about impermanence, because, you know, Tai Chi is embodying that, right? Embodying flow.
Please, Peter.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a philosopher, but this notion really touches on some ideas that come up in Taoism, in Tai Chi, but also in medicine, and that's our relationship with time. And we know from, you know, not to bring in quantum physics and things like that, but, you know, time is a funny structure, like we're all going someplace and we're all coming from someplace else. And I think, Willa, you've also had the opportunity, and maybe other people in this webinar, to study with Charles Genoux, who teaches gesture of awareness. And it really deconstructs time. He would do very simple embodied things like make a movement. And he'd say, where did it go? Can you make that same movement again? Nothing like that, but that same exact movement. Can you make it in the past? Can you make it in the future? And then he would just say, maybe we should just move. And there was a way of him bringing us right into maybe what you're calling the flow of the moment, the unfolding now, that I think is an embodied state, and does take away, as you said earlier, these ideas of ruminating of the past or the future. And there's some link to impermanence there, just this unfolding now that exists without the fear of something ending or going backwards.
Well, to stay in the flow, my last question for you before we move into the public Q&A with our participants, what does it look like to be in the flow of this challenging moment? You know, what does it look like to grieve collectively in this moment with all of the things we're facing, with COVID, with political strife, with divisions from racial inequality, and, you know, what are each of you doing to really be in the flow of this moment, or any advice that you can give, you know, to us as listeners? I'll go, Peter. We'll start with Peter.
Ooh, Willow would go first. I will say, this whole idea of connecting and doing things together, even through Zoom, I've been so touched by how intimate teaching and working with my colleagues and students has been. There's a sense of all of us needing that support, and the value of these practices is just revealing itself so much more strongly in these unusual times. And there's a way in which people, even though they're in their little room by themselves and they have their own Zoom box like we have here, there's almost an opportunity there where they're no longer in a class and relying on each other as much, but we're together as a group, but they're still owning their practice in their home. And when Zoom turns off, they continue that. So I would say in this time, the practices that we've been teaching and doing together have really become very important. And we're also grateful for it. I think it's redefining our commitment to how valuable these are.
Willa, closing thoughts on that?
And just to echo Peter's comments on community and how important it is in a time of isolation to learn to reach out, And another practice that I've been relying on a lot lately is practices of befriending whatever is coming up in response to what's happening with the planet, with racial tension, with COVID and the uncertainties that we're facing, to meet when we reflect on that, to meet whatever is coming up in the body. So we've been talking a lot about, and Peter talking so beautifully about the importance of the body for bringing that back into our discussion of what it means to be a whole human being, what it means to study and to do research on human flourishing and resilience, that the body has so much to offer. And So just my own take on what to do now, or my own personal practice around what to do now, is to keep coming home to the body and asking, how is it responding to whatever's arising? And then to meet that response in the body, to surround it with loving attention and to witness that. Our body too is a community. It's a community of feelings and a community of emotions. And just as we can be in community with others, we can learn to be in community with our own difficult states.
Thank you. Well, I have to say, it's been a wonderful experience being in community with both of you through this process and getting to know you both more personally. And I just want to thank you both for encouraging us all to explore the edges of these wisdom traditions. And as we move through the theory of human motivation towards self-actualization and awareness, it becomes more and more clear that we must nurture impermanence and suffering to understand the injustices within humanity. You really both just described that perfectly. And we have the capability to access the wisdom of our bodies by merging our minds and dare I say our environment to reach an awakening of bodhi or samadhi. So it's been truly inspiring to work with you both through this process. And I wish we had more time, but we're gonna move into public Q&A. So please continue to populate questions in the chat box. My team has been collecting those for me so that I can ask them directly for you. And you'll also have the option of raising your hand directly now through the Zoom features, and I'll bring you up live to ask your question directly. I'm going to keep my eyes open for the virtual raised hands and bring you up on screen, obviously time permitting. And there's going to be a quick transition time between me selecting you and transferring you into the room before you unmute and go live. And at that point, I invite you to unmute your mic, voice your question. So we're going to get started. I'm going to pose this first question to allow more questions to come in and hands to raise. This question is from Frank Schumann. It could be a question for both of you, but let's go back to Peter. Are bodily and mental practices shooting for the same aim via different paths or for different aims?
Hi, Frank. Nice to hear your question. I would say that we should begin exploring that question with semantics. Can you have a body without a mind? Can you have a mind without a body? And I would say that, like in Guy Claxton's quote, that mind in some ways emerges out of these processes that we call body, that there's a unity there. And I think sometimes that unity gets split. We get stuck in our heads, to be colloquial, or in Brooklyn, we'd say we have our heads in the freaking gutter. But you know, there's a split, but I think as, you know, Willa described, as we do our practices, as we settle in, as we realize that there is no future that we have to be concerned with, that the moment is enough to just experience things. I think there's unity there. I think that's what we're looking for. And whether it's an evolutionary model, you know, of survival, or whether it's a contemplative model of some other spiritual goals, I don't think we can separate the mind and the body. I think they are one and the same, especially on a good day.
Willow, would you like to add anything to that?
Oh, yeah, just thinking about, in addition to that, that in the Buddhist tradition, sometimes enlightenment is described, the actual, you could say that the fruition of all the path of meditation is described as the oneness of the body-mind. Dogen called it the oneness of the body-mind. And Yangompa, who's a Tibetan somatic theorist, he called it the inseparability of the body-mind. So that what we're actually doing when we're meditating is embodying that inseparability. That's what meditation is, the embodiment of the oneness of the body-mind. So just, that was coming to me as you were talking.
Yeah, and just to bring Srinivas's wonderful performance in, my sense is that the authenticity of his music emerges from that dance in the moment. It's not as if he's saying, oh, the next few notes I'm going to play, or the previous few notes I'm going to play, but he's improvising with himself and responding to what's unfolding. And I think that speaks to the lack of duality there. It's just when things are just right, it all comes together as one piece.
It's lovely. Thank you. This next question is from Christine Tello. Given divisiveness in society, how would you describe your message of listening to our bodies and focusing on community in simple terms to the average person versus those of us who are already believers? Maybe Willa, we can start with you.
Yeah, listening to the body. Let me just start, or maybe I'll just do that one and then. Yeah, listening to the body. So when you really learn to listen to your, first, maybe to say to non-believers, everything that we feel is experienced in the body. And I'm talking about emotion, everything that we feel, especially our difficult states, right? There's a correlation in the body. We feel stress and the posture hunches over, our belly contracts, our heart contracts. There's a visceral experience to stress. And so learning to, I could say, meditate with the emotions, or is to notice that those experiences that we think of as mental, right? There was a story attached. Such and such, so and so did such and such, and now I'm experiencing stress. Or COVID is happening, and now I'm experiencing stress. Or I'm watching the news, and now I'm experiencing stress. Is actually happening right in the present moment in your body. It's connected to a story, but it's happening right in the present moment in your body. And if you can befriend whatever that is that's arising and become graceful with that, it's possible to become graceful with COVID, or it's possible to become graceful with those things that we think of as being out there. Meditation is so much more than navel gazing, and it's much, much more than just calming down. It's learning to be with our difficult states with grace, so that we can learn to be with others with grace. That's how I'd say it for a beginner.
Peter, did you want to add anything to that?
I can try.
No wrong answers here.
The first thing I noted was this idea of gut feelings. Like we have gut feelings. In Brooklyn, we would say we have this built-in BS meter. And when we perceive something, we could think of it intellectually, but like, what's your gut say? What's the embodied kind of read on that? And so I think that the body can play a role in reading situations if we're more connected to it, and then we can get a better read for it. And then I think similarly, how we react to it is benefited by in the more embodied state that Willa and I are talking about. And often in meditation, they say, mind the gap. But because you're in your body, and it's not just this labile thought and emotional reaction, it has the anchor of a bit more substance. We have more time to see it in a certain way and react to it in a more measured way. And I think, again, coming back to what I was saying before, contemplate your navel and think globally, act locally. I think having these tools helps us navigate and discern these really challenging social and environmental issues that we're facing out there with a little bit more clarity and a little bit more non-reactive choice.
You both have talked so much about community and, global connection. Can you both maybe just share some of the work that you're doing to help create inclusive spaces that support conversations around this practice of embodiment or, mind-body connection, just so people can, know where to find out more about the work that you're doing or what they should be watching for? That makes sense. Willa,
Oh,
we'll say you
okay.
first.
Yeah. Yeah, what comes to mind at the moment when you're offering that question is just recently. So I am a part of a retreat center up north from where I am at the moment in Boston, in New Hampshire, Wonderwell Mountain Refuge. That's our community, the Dharma community that I'm involved with these days. And we recently were thinking, in fact, starting years ago, beginning to think about how can we do something as contemplatives, as meditators, those who go inwards and observe the inner state, the inner weather. How can we do something meaningful about climate change? What can we do when my mind even goes to climate change? It seems so enormous,
Daunting, yeah.
so almost like I can't even turn my mind there, because to turn it there is to turn towards the potential demise of our planet, in its furthest iteration. And that's a kind of a death, right? To turn our mind towards death is a difficult thing. So what we started to do at Wonderwell, we're talking about the power of community and connection, is why don't we start with these small conversations where we just get together and we talk about our own grief and talk about not only that, but activity. What can we do as a community to move beyond grief towards meaningful action? And so we started these councils, and with the help of Sarah Buey and some other people in my community, to create eco-sattva councils, which is to say ecological councils of ecological compassionate discussion. And those have yielded, so almost like a think tank, yielded real action, yielded deeper relationships. And so I think what I really learned from that, this is an experiment we had never done before in our larger meditation community, was the power of small groups and really intimate discussion to seed action. And we were able to see that as an actual living thing happening on the ground. It was very, very exciting. That's what I can offer as something that we were doing recently that reflects some of the power of Sangha, to actually move us from an individual awakening to a collective awakening.
Love that. Thank you, Willa. Peter, do you have any things to share about community building?
Yeah, I mean, on one end of my spectrum, I have my little Tai Chi community here in Boston, which is now virtual, and I sort of hide out in it, and I like keeping it intimate, and it's a place for me to practice and have a nice group of people to explore this with. In my day job, so to speak, at the Harvard Medical School and Brigham Women's Osher Center, there's a lot of community things going on. So at the highest level, our center is what we call a center without walls. And we became this unsiloed catalyst to bring together all the other rich activities and contemplative mind-body practices going on across all the Harvard campuses. So the Center for Health and Happiness, the Chen Sui Center for Chinese and Integrative Medicine, the Herb Benson Institute for Mind Body. So we sort of bring people together and try to create community and connectivity, see if there's more in the whole than the sum of the parts. The other thing we're doing is trying to penetrate strategically into places to give people a taste of all these practices that are not easily findable. So tonight, after this event, I have the privilege of being part of a wellness program. So all of the Harvard Medical School students, medical students and dental students will have a chance to explore mind-body practices, and I'll actually teach a 30-minute session on embodied movement. And this year, our education director, Darshan Mehta, 2 years ago, we were one of the first medical schools at Harvard Medical School to make this mind-body training and resilience training required course. So early on, as physicians learn about healing, they're learning about healing themselves and developing skills to become more resilient in that very, very challenging space of being a healthcare provider. So I think that's one of the ways we're trying to influence our communities, by penetrating in really strategic places and bringing people together.
Thank you. So important for people to hear, real lived experiences that people are doing, and people sharing the work out there, and to see themselves in that work. So thank you so much. This question just came in from Rania Renee. Could you speak to the separation of body and mind in the Western approach to medicine, to art, and etc., in its historical devaluing of the body, in its historical devaluing of the body's wisdom in favor of the analytical mind, because this could be seen as a form of white supremacy. So speaking of the separation of the body and mind in the Western approach, maybe Willa, it says for both of you. So Willa.
Yeah, I think when I reflect on that, I feel like we're all, at some degree, our education in the West is based on a premise that our body and our mind are separate, with a great deal of privileging of the mind in our educational system, that if we can sharpen the mind and develop the mind and work hard using our mental capacity, that is our definition of success. That is our definition of doing well. And just even that idea is such an idea that separates, right? That mind is one thing and the body is something quite other. And I do think that in Eastern traditions, there is much more of a longer history of non-dual thought, as opposed to the Cartesian dualism that we have grown up with and been educated with. And I do think, yes, that there is something about that separating of the body and the mind that privileges this hierarchy of the conceptual. And actually, when we really look at it, especially if you start to meditate or you do an introspective or a contemplative practice, you begin to notice that in fact a lot more is going on than just the conceptual mind. A lot more exists. There is space, there is the body, there are the senses, there's the present moment, what we're actually feeling, there's the feeling of our breath, there's the feeling of the body sitting wherever it's sitting. There's so much coming in, so much, and sound. There's so much happening that is non-conceptual. And in privileging the conceptual, we actually miss a tremendous resource for resilience, which are the non-conceptual side of our experience, which is much more non-dual with its world. So I do think there is something about that. And the othering, right, that is so much a part of white supremacy, that there's me and the other. That othering is tied in to that notion that self and other is something real, as opposed to interdependence, as opposed to the non-conceptual moment in which we are all one and partaking. I think there is something there to that some of the social problems that we're encountering in our world could be addressed or ameliorated by a greater attention to dissolving the boundaries between self and other through dissolving the boundaries between mind and body. I think there's a connection there.
That's beautiful. Peter, would you like to tag on briefly to that before we bring Srinivas up?
Yeah, very briefly, I would just say that, there's an unnatural selection that happens in our educational system. It really favors people who can sit still with their hands quiet in a small desk and take information in and put it out in a very head-oriented way. There's not a lot of appreciation for movement and art and those sorts of things. And I think there are some, and I have no knowledge really about pedagogy and how to teach, but I think there are systems out there that are much more body-oriented, that appreciate the diversity of ways of learning and different types of intelligence. And until we sort of broaden it away from the sort of more academic fit into a really good SAT score kind of model. We're not going to be promoting the diversity of people that we want to bring as doers and leaders in the future. And of course, we need to improve access for everybody to that kind of education. But I think the quality of the education has to change as well.
Thank you so much for lifting that up, Peter. I'm wondering if Srinivas is available to join us now. I wanted to bring him in briefly for a question for him. Hi.
Hi.
Lovely performance. That was so great. Such a great way to start these episodes with music and art. So Srinivas, I think about the instruments that you use as a complement to this conversation so much, the sitar, and I believe you play the tabla too, but I might be incorrect.
No.
And no, okay, so just the sitar. And I think about how it just complements this conversation on theories of human motivation. We've seemingly you have this inanimate instrument, the sitar, and yet it's this means to connect cultures and create social belonging and to bring people together through the music. And clearly it's led you to have a deeper understanding towards a form of self-actualization, however that looks like. Can you share maybe some insights on the thought-provoking power of classical Indian music or the music that you share?
Yeah, well, first, I just want to say thank you to Peter for the comment earlier, which we could talk about too, about improvising and the kind of being in the moment quality of improvised music of any kind, or art just generally, or the creative kind of spirit generally. But to what you were asking, Shankri, actually the sitar is not inanimate. The sitar is a totally animate thing, and we think of instruments with souls. That's why we never step over our instruments. That's like one of the main rules, is never step over your instrument, because, well, in India, we don't step over a human being because they also have a soul. So the sitar is very much alive, and like the gourd and the wood and everything it's living, and it changes over time. It gets seasoned, what we say. So the more you play it, the more it responds to you. I think the beauty, though, I mean, I know what you're saying, though, too, in the sense that, the sitar's not going to walk away and leave my room or something.
Yeah.
But I think the beauty of that part of the instrument, or that part of art, is it responds exactly to what you give. The more you give yourself to your practice of the instrument and love for that instrument, cleaning the instrument properly, keeping it nicely, practicing every day, then it starts responding more, and is more, the sounds are better, it doesn't go out of tune. And so it's like this feedback loop, so you have to give in order for the sitar to give back. My guru used to always tell me that you have to love your instrument, not only in terms of doing the scales and thinking about music, but the body of the sitar, you have to clean it, you have to keep it in a nice place, you have to, so both of those things together, I think, are really important.
Thank you so much. Sure. Yeah, I agree. And as a fellow musician, I'm glad that you talked about the instrument not being inanimate. So that's great. So at this time, we bring a call to action to share, not only with the three of you, but we also encourage our participants to engage in this final question, the signature question that we always ask to the three guests. So I'll start with Willa. And the question is, what is one action step or insight that you'll take from this conversation today and perhaps carry through into your life? And again, I invite our audience to respond as well in the chat.
Well, I think it's related to one of them is related to Srinivas's playing. When he was playing and I was closing my eyes and feeling the sitar in my body and feeling it, the vibration of that in my body, I was reminded that contemplative practice is a form of deep listening, and that what we're doing is listening to the body. And it's very much like listening to music, the way that music can captivate and draw in and actually take us out of our suffering, can relieve us of suffering. Just like meditation relieves us of suffering, music relieves us of suffering. And so just thinking about that connection of deep listening and the power of deep listening to bring us into states of greater ease and greater focus and greater relaxation. And so maybe what I'm taking from this is the connection between listening to music and listening to the body in meditation.
It's beautiful.
Yeah.
Peter, one action step or insight that you're taking from this conversation today?
I think it brings me back to my practice. You know, I'm probably the most nervous, neurotic Tai Chi teacher I know, and yet I've been able to overcome that and share the practices and be out in a very public space. And so I think, you know, I think sticking with this inner work so that I can stay out of my way and try to make small differences out there and let other people know that even being nervous and being afraid, as Willa said, just being kind to those things that come up and integrating them is a way of letting other people feel more empowered and being part of something bigger.
Thank you. Srinivas, in the spirit of going with the flow.
Yeah, going with the flow. Well, yeah, there's a lot. I guess one thing I'm grateful for is just to have had this opportunity again to connect with new people and old friends. And I guess the action point, as much as possible, to just continue to create more of that sense of good community, you know, making decisions to spend more time, you know, watching Mind and Life video and maybe instead of some other types of videos, and you know, always reorienting towards something kind of positive and wholesome, I think is what I would think about. So thank you.
Love it. Conscious decision making. It's
Yeah.
wonderful. So after such beautiful reflections and action steps, I'm going to invite Willa to come up on screen and lead us in a beautiful contemplative guided meditation. We'll just take about 3 minutes for this, Willa. So Willa, please.
Let's take a moment to settle the body. And feel your body as a field of warm water. As if your body were a vessel of warm water. In that vessel, there's movement, there's the movement of the breath, there's the feeling of the air on your skin. And there's the heaviness of the body. The weight of this vessel. And imagining that your mind is like a handful of salt. You toss that handful of salt into this vessel of warm water so that the mind dissolves evenly all over the body. And rest in the oneness of the body-mind.
Thank you, Willa. So, in closing, today we honored and celebrated Peter's work and celebrated and honored the memory of Cathy Kerr, an explorer of rich edges. She's a revolutionary human being. We've been programmed to think about the mind and body as separate, which are probably the cause of so many of our social issues, such as othering. And Peter and Willa reminded us to examine our own ecosystems and to listen to our own bodies. They reminded us that being present in the unfolding now takes away from ruminating about the past or present. So thank you to our 3 distinguished guests today for this enlightening and enriching conversation. As mentioned before, we will be gathering together next month for our January episode of Inspiring Minds, which will take place on Wednesday, January 13th, and we'll be joined by Jack Cornfield, Rhonda McGee, with a live performance by dynamic duo DJ Drez and Marty Nico. The theme will be mindfulness, resilience, and compassion for the new year. And registration is now open for our event through the Mind and Life website. As always, thank you so much for joining us today. Deep gratitude and appreciation to our Mind and Life team, which works tirelessly behind the scenes. And please continue to stay connected to Mind and Life as we move forward in these challenging times. Thank you. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Srinivas. Thank you, Willa.
Thank you, Shankri.